welcome those who will be joining us whenever you see this video on YouTube for the Morehead Church of Christ Wednesday evening Bible study. We are studying through the book of Judges, and we are going to resume our study of chapter 8. In Judges chapter 8, it deals with the aftermath of the battle and the victorious defeat of the Midianites to end the oppression of Israel. And so they've essentially won the battle, and sort of what we have is really Gideon really getting the rest of the job done. The rest of the Midianites essentially are trying to escape. And so Gideon is trying to hunt them down and destroy them so that they don't have a chance to really rise up again and cause problems for Israel. So last week we covered the first 3 verses. I'm only going to read those just to bring us up to speed, and then we'll actually go into the reading of verses 4 through 12. So it says in Judges chapter 8, beginning verse 1, it says, "The men of Ephraim said to him, 'What is this thing you have done to us, not calling us when you went to fight against Midian?' And they contended with him vigorously. But he said to them, 'What have I done now in comparison with you? Is not the gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim better than the vintage of Abiezer? God has given the leaders of Midian, Oreb and Zeeb, into your hand, and what was I able to do in comparison with you?' Then their anger toward him subsided when he said that." So we are going to go on to verses 4 through 12. So, Brother Timothy, would you be interested in reading 4 through 8? And Brother Kendall, 9 through 12, please?
Judges
Chapter 8, 4 through 8.
Okay, 4 through 8. So Gideon then crossed the Jordan River with his 300 men, and though exhausted, they continued to chase the enemy. When they reached Sukkot, Gideon asked the leaders of the town, "Please give my warriors some food. They are very tired. I am chasing Zebah and Zalmunna, the kings of Midian." But the officials of Sukkot replied, "Catch Zebah and Zalmunna first, and then we will feed your army." 7. So Gideon said, "After the Lord gives me victory over Zebah and Zalmunna, I will return and tear your flesh with the thorns and briars of the wilderness." 8. From there, Gideon went up to Pania and again asked for food, but he got the same answer. So he said to the people of Pania, "After I return in victory, I will tear down this tower."
So he spoke also to the men of Penuel, saying, "When I return safely, I will tear down this tower." Now Zebah and Zalmunna were in Karkor, and their armies with them, about 15,000 men, all of who were left of the entire army of the sons of the east, for the fallen were 120,000 swordsmen. Gideon went up by the way of those who lived in tents on the east of Nobah and Jogbeah, and attacked the camp when the camp was unsuspecting. When Zebah and Zalmunna fled, he pursued them and captured the 2 kings of Midian, Zebah and Zalmunna, and routed the whole army.
All right, so really the success of Gideon continues, but what we can see here, looking at verses 4 through 12, is that these men had accomplished something great, Gideon and his army, and the troops have been fighting, they've been pursuing it, and really they're becoming weary. They're in desperate need of nourishment, and what they're trying to do is to essentially go after the Midianites when they're sort of in a weakened condition, before they really have a chance to set up somewhere else and maybe try to kind of launch an attack against the Israelites. And so we have 2 key people here that they're after, and that is Zebah and Zalmunna. So they are trying to capture these key players, they're kings, and it's sort of like the idea of cutting the head off the snake. If we get these guys, essentially, we are going to bring down really the rest of the army. But as we're kind of looking at this, and we kind of consider what happens, what's happening here, and looking at verse 4 there, how does the action of Gideon and his soldiers inspire us today as Christian soldiers as we fight the daily battle against the spiritual forces of wickedness? So I'm looking at verse 4, and I want you to see there that, Gideon and his army are weary. How does their action here in what we've read in the rest of the verses sort of inspire us as Christian soldiers today? Right?
And they were tired, but they didn't quit.
Okay, so this is something, the idea is that they could have said, we've put so much effort in this, and, we're just tired, and, we're just going to, we're all going to settle in, and we'll get around to maybe dealing with these guys later. There's a time sometimes that you can put things off, and there's a time when you shouldn't put things off, and this is one of those times you shouldn't put things off. Everything is in your favor. If you essentially say, well, we're too tired to continue to pursue them, essentially every advantage you had is going to be lost. And so we look at this and we see it from a Christian soldier today. You as well as I have probably heard many a Christian say, sometimes I'm just tired of living the Christian life. We've heard something like that. We're just tired of it because you're always having to put forth effort, and you're always having to battle against sin, and you're always having to strive to do what's right, and it's tired and exhausting. When should the Christian soldier quit the fight? Never. Okay, so when you hear Christians say, I get so tired, what they're really saying is, I'm on the verge of giving up. And the idea is there's no advantage if you give up. And so what we see here in Gideon is the idea is there's a time to continue to fight. And as long as we're in this realm, we've got to continue to fight against, fight the spiritual battle until either death comes to us or the Lord returns. And there's a verse that came to mind as I was considering that, and that's what Paul said in 2 Timothy 4 and verse 7. He says, I have fought the good fight. He's near the end of his life. 2 Timothy is the last book that he writes. He says, I have fought the good fight. I have finished the course. I have kept the faith. In the future there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day, and not only to me, but also to all who have loved his appearing.
Right there
What's
should
that?
be a goal right there.
Yeah.
Well done, good and faithful servant.
Yeah.
The crown of life.
Right.
And stuff. If people would look at that, right there, that's what I do
Yeah.
as well. Even though you fail, don't grow weary.
Yeah.
Well doing, you got to keep going.
Right.
Don't be discouraged because the devil works on that and
Sure.
stuff. Things do get tired,
Right.
trials, temptations and stuff, tribulations and stuff. But you've got to keep praying.
Right.
You've got to keep trying, for the inspiration, for the, to keep going and not keep a good attitude about the situation.
Sure.
And stuff, because, things will get better. This too will end,
Sure.
And that's the kind of attitude you got to have. It may be bad right now, but,
Yeah.
it's going to end,
Well,
it's not going to last
Right,
forever
right.
and stuff, so.
So now's the time to fight. That if you say, well, it's so hard to live the Christian life, I just want to kick back for a while, I just don't want to put forth the effort, there is no spiritual advantage to that. What we read in the scripture, the Hebrew writer will talk about heaven as a land of rest, as a place of rest. When do we quit fighting the good fight of faith?
Never.
When we get to heaven, right?
Yeah.
When we get into the land of rest. And so if you know that there's no benefit in not continuing to suit up with a Christian suit of armor and fight the good fight, then there's no point in going there and saying, I'm just so tired of fighting this. Because as soon as you get too tired to fight that fight and you let your guard down, then it's over with.
Because God's not going to drop it in your lap.
Right.
It's just like a
Right.
job. You work for that paycheck
Right.
and stuff. In this case,
Yeah.
you've got to work to be obedient.
Yep.
And if you don't, you fall from grace
Yeah.
and stuff. So that's the kicker, you
Yeah.
know, and it gets hard through these trials, tribulations, storms, and people are so tempted to give up, or something don't happen their way, or the way they pray, or something. And they think, you know, the Lord's not helping them. And the Lord is always helping us. That's the mistake number one people make. Like the children of Israel, they said, you know, where's the promise? And stuff. They would have been stupid and saying things like that because God had already brought them over from Egypt and stuff, and He was going to bring more things too. And stuff that's, you know, they could have made it to the other land and stuff. They talked about, you know, the melons, the onions, the garlic. They would have seen that if they went to the other land and stuff, but they were disobedient.
Right, they were disobedient, so you gotta listen to God. I think Gideon's one of the ideas is that we can actually be able to accomplish the rest of the mission, but we have to continue to pursue the enemy. And that's the encouragement we see, is there's times when we get weary and maybe weak going through life. It's a lot going on, but the idea is this lesson says to me here, this example says to me, don't ever give up.
These attacks, you know, bad times, we must realize those are coming from the devil.
Right.
When you are tempted to give up or you're going through something, you know, and it's hard, you know, this is the devil trying to get you to fall from grace and not listen to God, because He knows his future's going to hell.
The Christian life has to be self-motivated. In other words, God can give you the incentive, but you have to be self-motivated. You have to recognize this is for my benefit. God has done everything possible it takes for me to get to heaven, short of essentially living the Christian life for me. The rest of it is up to me. And understanding what God's done for me, the idea is that I don't get focused on all the things I have to do. I'm focused on what Christ did on the cross for me. That helps me to put things in perspective. Look at what God was willing to do in order to save me. This is really a small price I pay to follow Jesus. Let's go on, unless there's any questions or comments about verse 4. We'll go on to verse 5. He says that, and he said to the men, this is Gideon at Succoth, please give us loaves of bread to the people who are following me, for they are weary, and I am pursuing Zebah and Zalmunna, the kings of Midian. And on a Bible map, if you have one, Succoth is located about 30 miles southeast of where the battle was fought, on the eastern side of the Jordan River in the territory of Gad. Gideon and our men are weary, in need of nourishment to sustain them. That they're in hot pursuit of the enemy to get Zebah and Zalmunna. And if they do that, they know this is sort of going to rein in really the rest of this oppression. And so they come and they ask the people of Succoth for this sustenance. And in return, they get a response in verse 6, are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna already in your hands, that we should give bread to your army? So we have to ask why Gideon, or not why these men are saying this Gideon.
I might be jumping in a little bit here, but I was just going to say, sounds like they're saying, you need to finish the job before we're going to give you food. Get back out there.
You know, that's pretty close. It seems like that's very, very close to essentially what it is. But if these people, this is within the territory of Gad and they're Israelites, they have an obligation in terms of hospitality, if nothing else. These are the troops of Israel, and they're coming to your doorstep. They've been fighting this enemy of Israel, and essentially you're telling them that you're not going to give them food. And it's tied to this Zebah and Zalmunna. And it seems more so not that they say, go finish the job first and we'll reward you for your effort, but they are in fear that essentially if these men are still out there and they have a sizable force in that area, that repercussions may come to them when Gideon and his men leave. So this really seems to be more fear-oriented versus, hey, you lazies, get out there and finish the job, and then you can belly up, we'll serve you some good chow when it's over. So it seems to be more that they're acting in fear, and this is why they say that. Matthew Henry's commentary on the book of Judges here, this passage says, about the leaders of Succoth, it says, the bowels of their compassion were shut up against their brethren. They were as destitute of love as they were of faith. would not give morsels of bread to those who were ready to perish. And so it seems like the idea is they were not very good helpers to God's people. By the way, the people of Succoth, we're doing you a favor. These are our enemies. Okay, but if this comes down to it, which it seems to be that they're motivated out of fear, that the idea they're afraid of Midianite retaliation later, it really shows us something about these people. Okay, what does it show about the people here in Succoth in relation to their enemies versus God? What does it show us? God is with Gideon, but they're afraid of Midianite appraisal. What does that say about where they're at?
You talking about the Israelites or the enemies?
Well, we're talking really about the men of Succoth, which are Israelites, and really they're not supporting their own troops in Gideon because they're afraid of Midianite
Well, they don't have
reprisal.
faith.
Okay, so they're afraid. Okay, there's reason to be afraid, but who are they afraid? Who should they be afraid of?
God.
They essentially have reverent fear for God. God is essentially with Gideon. God has essentially brought about this great victory of troops that are, the Bible writer says that they're as numerous as locusts, and Gideon, against all odds, is able to take down the whole bunch with 300 men. Now, how much of this we don't, that they
Well, they're
knew, we
less
didn't
in
know.
number, and they'll think they can overtake because there's more on the other side, isn't there?
Well, these are the people that seem to escape, and we don't know to what extent they have a presence there, but to what extent the idea that they see that as a place of refuge, this is where they can go. But it really shows you, a lack of faith on behalf of the men of Succoth. In other words, why are you worried about these guys when essentially the Lord is with Gideon? He's brought about this great defeat, and they're really chasing after the rest of them. And essentially, you're more afraid of a reprisal from these guys than you are to really see that these are God's people. You're doing an injustice. You're really depriving these men of really that shot in the arm that they need to sort of finish the job. They're weary, and really the food is going to sort of
But they ain't gonna
revive
get the
them.
prize if they don't do what God says,
Right.
They should have faith, and when they conquer these people, surely God's gonna reward them.
Okay.
So,
really they made a poor error of judgment here in relation to this situation. What they should have done is they should have acted in faith. Sometimes when you act in faith, you are going to act in a capacity that you have no, really, in relation to fear. I mean, the idea is when David went and fought Goliath, I mean, if we didn't know the rest of the story and we just sort of look at the two players getting ready to come into battle, who are we going to think is going to win?
you gotta be like Abraham was. He didn't know what was gonna happen.
So we're going to think that it's a done deal. Goliath is going to win, but God was with David, and if God was with David, David was going to win. And if God was with Gideon, Gideon's going to win.
You can't lose with God. That's
Right,
the
and so
thing.
these people, these men of Succoth need to understand that if God is with Gideon, you don't have to worry about this reprisal. God is going to be with you. And I think it teaches us a tremendous lesson about being paralyzed by fear. If we're paralyzed by fear, essentially, we're not going to act in faith. Yeah, most situations are kind of scary. David going to fight against Goliath, he'd never encountered that in his life. Yeah, he fought lions, and he fought bears, and he was victorious, but he had never fought a trained, hardened soldier. And yet the idea is he knew that God was with him. He knew because God was with him, he was going to prevail. And the lesson is that if God is with us today, what is it that we will not prevail in with? We will only not prevail in things. Yeah, we will only not prevail in things that we are paralyzed by fear to do. and this is just a lesson that we have to learn as Christians, because there are a lot of things out there that can really sort of intimidate us. I mean, we think about the COVID situation, and in blue states, essentially you have governors that are really wanting to shut everything down, and essentially not let people, worship and things like that. And essentially, if you do, there's going to be consequences. Well, we shut down for a brief period of time, but before long, we started right back up because, the detriment against the spiritual well-being of the brethren was worse than trying to think about, what the civil government may actually do because we violated the policy.
I was gonna say, we did have worship outside too, and that.
Worshipped outside. Eventually we had to come back inside, and we tried to work within the framework, but there comes a point where it is more detrimental to God's people not to meet together and then have people that essentially say that you can go to the liquor store and get liquor and that's okay, or you can do all these other things, but to deprive people of essentially Christians of worshiping together, and essentially we cannot be afraid of civil leaders if we're trying to obey the Word of God. We cannot be afraid, in terms of leadership, we cannot be afraid of opposing false teachers in the church. We cannot be afraid of essentially dealing with difficult matters where you have a member in sin and you call them out, you call them to account. We can't be afraid, because fear can paralyze us from doing the things that we should be doing. And so I think this is, the message here is that, these people, these men of Succoth, had the opportunity to be heroes, to really put on a big spread for these men. They weren't saying, grab your whatever you got, we're going to go fight. All they wanted to do was essentially to get something to eat, but they couldn't even get that. Thoughts or comments about some of the things I've talked about here? Questions? Okay. If not, let's go on to verse 7. It says, and Gideon said, all right, when the Lord has given Zebah and Zalmunna into my hand, then I will thrash your bodies with the thorns of the wilderness and with briars. And so Gideon's not happy with the leaders of Succoth. They were cowards. Think about that. The idea is they were cowardly. They acted in a hostile manner. The idea is these men need to be fed, and you can do it. That's why we came here.
What's a briar?
What's that?
What's a briar?
Well, let me hold on to that a little bit. We're going to get to that. The idea is they're going to get punished with them. I want us to notice here before we get there, though, the contrast that we see here with Gideon's words as opposed to the words of the leaders of Succoth about the Midianite king. So, while they may be afraid of a reprisal, Gideon says, when the Lord has given Zebah and Zalmunna into my hand, in other words, he's confident. He has absolute certainty and trust in the Lord that this is a done deal. This is going to happen, whereas the men of Succoth are essentially saying these guys could essentially come back and we're going to be punished as a result of it. So Gideon's words are a rebuke of their lack of faith and a warning of impending judgment or punishment they will face for their hostile response to himself and his men. We should not feel sorry for what Gideon said to these men. They have it coming. They could have right there saying, brother, I'm sorry that we respond that way. You're right. You know what? God's handed you the victory. Hey guys, jump in there. Let's get some food for these men to eat. So it's not as if, even if they started on the wrong foot, that they couldn't correct their mistake. It's just that they never did that. So the briars are, according to Brown Driver's Big Hebrew Lexicon, they're a prickly or thorny plant. And the thrashing here has to do with a severe beating, to beat with a whip or rod. The New King, or the New International Version, New King James Version, actually says in this part here, I will tear your flesh. So what was the nature of the punishment as described in the words of Gideon? It seems there, among commentators, this might be somewhat some part of a punishment short of death, with other commentators, this means essentially these people are going to die. And Jameson, Faust, and Brown's commentary here in Judges says it is a cruel torture to which captives were often subjected in ancient times by having thorns and briars placed on their naked bodies and pressed down by sledges or heavy implements of husbandry or agriculture equipment being dragged over them. That sounds pretty awful, pretty painful. And so the thing is you know what? They're really acting in a very hostile manner to Gideon and his men, and he's telling them right there. And it's interesting the fact that there's no response. Like, well, maybe we acted a little hostile, and we're going to do. There's no response, as if sort of the idea is they have no confidence that they're going to see this man again. So, okay. Any other questions or comments about that? Okay, let's go on to verse 8. He says, and he went up from there, that is Gideon, to Penuel, and spoke similarly to them. And the men of Penuel answered him, just as the men of Succoth had answered. In other words, all right, we're not getting something to eat. Here, let's go down the road a little bit. We'll go to this other place. Penuel, by the way, is a place where Jacob wrestled with the man until daybreak. It's also... well, we'll skip that part. But a city was built here eventually, and this is, of course, in Gad. Penuel is about 40 miles northeast of Jerusalem. And unfortunately, these men make the same sort of tragic mistake in dealing with Gideon and his men. I mean, you know, we can look at it before. So right now, Gideon, in their assessment, does not have the full battle or the full control of the situation. But the idea is that requires faith on their part. The idea, again, that God is with Gideon, that he has prevailed in such a great way. And, you know, he's come here. The idea is we're looking for a little bit of help, and essentially they're getting nothing. To me, it's really sort of an embarrassment. These are God's people. It's a scar in terms of what's happening, all the good things. And these people essentially have not contributed one iota to it. So, verse 9, talking about Gideon, so he spoke also to the men of Penuel, saying, when I return safely, I will tear this tower. And again, the idea of the confidence of Midian can be seen. That he's not thinking, well, it's, you know, we're going to get slaughtered. You know, it's going to be bad. These guys are eventually. He's absolutely confident that he is going to return. And when he does, it's not going to go well for the people that have so shamefully treated him. A tower, by the way, according to Nelson's Illustrated Bible Dictionary, is a tall building erected for defense. And so it says that landowners sometimes use towers to protect their crops. So you'd have thieves coming whenever they could. And the idea of the elevation and be able to sort of look at things in terms of your crops to keep thieves from stealing it. It's also used to watch for those approaching marauders. And in cities, towers were part of the walls built for defensive purposes. So you can have a lookout, you can have a higher elevation. If you have enemy coming up on the city, it gives you a position advantage. So essentially the fact of destroying that would destroy a major asset for the city. Okay. Verse 10, it says, now Zebah and Zalmunna were in Karkor, and their armies were with them, about 15,000 men, all who were left of the entire army of the sons of the east, for the fallen were 120,000 swordsmen. So we're getting somewhat idea of how many they started out with, how many they have left. And so there's still a good number of these troops that are left. Karkor is located in the Transjordan. So the Transjordan is east of the Jordan River, and apparently it's in the area of East Manasseh, Gad, and Reuben. So it's on this side.
Yeah, I just had a question. So it said they lost 120,000 men. Now, is that probably from all the confusion, Or would that have been, you know, Gideon and the 300 taking out 120?
Well, remember that after they did what they did in terms of their pictures and there's all that there was chaos going on in the camp as they sort of thought.
That's what I mean.
But what I'm saying is the idea is that it seems that a lot to some extent, you know, they were responsible for taking each other out, but at some point they get additional troops, so it's hard to say how many essentially they killed of themselves and how many once they were on the run, you know, how many were killed. But it gives you sort of an idea. That's a lot of men, and now they only have you know, 15,000 left. Still a sizable amount. Verse 11 it says, "And Gideon went up by way of those who lived in tents on the east of Nob and Jobiah, and attacked the camp when the camp was unsuspecting." So you kind of get the impression that Zebah and Zalmunna feel like they're in a pretty good place. They're set up, but they really have no idea what's coming their way. So it's talking about those who lived in tents. We're talking about nomadic people. But Gideon somehow finds out about it. So verse 10 is sort of a, you know, the Bible writer's note about really what's taken place in terms of the troops and all that, and where Zebah and Zalmunna are. And then somehow Gideon finds out where they're at. We're not told how he learns of it, but he does. And of course, they attack the camp. The Amplified Bible says, "and smote their camp unexpectedly, for the army thought itself was secure." Verse 12 says, "When Zebah and Zalmunna fled, he pursued them and captured the 2 kings of Midian, Zebah and Zalmunna, and routed the whole army." To rout something, the word means to defeat or to overthrow. And so the idea is again, they are in a position of advantage. You know, Gideon's in a position of advantage. They're able to capture these kings against, they're thrown off, and you know, it's really the end is in sight for really the rest of those who had, you know, power in Midian. Unless there's any questions, we're going to read 13 through 17. Ryan, you want to read that?
Sure. Then Gideon the son of Joash returned from the battle by the ascent of Heres, and he captured a youth from Succoth and questioned him. Then the youth wrote down for him the princes of Succoth and its elders, 77 men. He came to the men of Succoth and said, "Behold, Zebah and Zalmunna, concerning whom you taunted me, saying, Are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna already in your hand, that we should give bread to your men who are weary?" He took the elders of the city and thorns of the wilderness and briars, and he disciplined the men of Succoth with them. He tore down the tower of Penuel and killed the men of the city. Then he said to Zebah,
Okay, that's probably good. Verse 17.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. So here we're talking about, he's talking about Gideon returning from the battle at the ascent of Heres. So ascent, the idea of an elevated place, perhaps a mountain pass. And Heres essentially means sun. And then according to Zondervan Pictorial Bible Dictionary, it's a place east of the Jordan River from which Gideon returned after his defeat. So this is all they really have to say about that. Verse 14, it's talking about Gideon captured a youth from Succoth and questioned him. Then the youth wrote down for him the princes of Succoth and its elders and 77 men. Why was this? What did Gideon want from this young man?
Who are your leaders?
Who are the leaders? Because guess what? Bad things are coming to them. Now, you know, we don't know, we don't have the picture, but obviously all of them were in cahoots. And not a single one should really be left out of really the punishment that's coming their way. And that's the whole purse. You know, give us the list, So 77 men on the list. These men will now face the consequences of really their treacherous action. Verse 15 says, he came to the men of Succoth, behold, and said, behold, Zebah and Zalmunna, concerning whom you taunted me, saying, are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna already in your hand, that we should give bread to your men who are weary? The idea of taunting is to say, according to Brown Driver Briggs Hebrew Lexicon, to say sharp things again. So a taunt would be sort of insult or sarcastic. And so, you know, one thing that we miss here is the reaction of the men of Succoth seeing Gideon and his men come back. You know, they're not told sort of like, they go, or uh-oh, or anything like that. We're not really given anything if they were surprised or fearful. The fact that here's Gideon, he's back, just like he said he was. This is completely left out, and, you know, we can only imagine. And it seems, verse 16, it's just very casually written. And he took the elders of the city and thorns of the wilderness and briars and disciplined the men of Succoth with them. We get the impression from verse 17 that what happened to those guys really happened to the men in Succoth. So the NIV in verse 16 writes, the latter part of verse 16 says, and taught the men of Succoth a lesson by punishing them with desert thorns and briars. So I'm going to read a couple of quotes here I thought might help us kind of understand how he disciplined the men. Arthur E. Kundal and Leon Morris in their Tyndale commentary on Judges says about Gideon that he proceeded to show resolution in carrying out his threat, and these inhospitable men were subjected to a form of torture which almost certainly ended in their death. The punishment was drastic, and it witnesses to the heinousness of the offense in Gideon's eyes. Bob Winton, in his outline commentary on Judges, says, quote, Gideon did to these men what he promised to do. The method of punishment was cruel and deadly. The victims were placed on the ground covered with thorns and briars, and a heavy sledge was pulled over them, pushing the thorns into the flesh. Perhaps the sledges were heavy enough to crush them, with the thorns and briars added to increase the pain or ensure death. The layer of thorns and briars may have been placed underneath the victims. So, you know, it didn't pay to have such a weak faith. Because essentially, we don't have God sort of weighing in that he's unhappy with Gideon. It seems very much that he was in lockstep with what Gideon was doing here. These men should have rallied around Gideon. They were heroes. Gideon and his men were heroes. They were accomplishing God's work. And these guys were really losers. I mean, they just didn't do what they should have done. Okay, any questions about what we've read so far there? Talked about. Verse 17, he moves on to Penuel. Gideon does, and it says, and he tore down the tower of Penuel and killed the men of the city. I mean, Gideon's obviously not happy. Not happy about how he was treated. Maybe this is going to be something that everybody's going to remember. You know, we've got to come together. We are all on the same team. Never should we encounter such a injustice as what we received from these people here. These places would have been sort of an embarrassment for their really inhospitable ways towards really, a hero. So
he finally kills the people that's been starving.
Responsible for it.
Yeah.
So it sounds like pretty much the leaders. I mean, that's certainly what happened with the men of Succoth, and it says the men of the city of Penuel. Maybe it was all the men. I don't know. Maybe they were all responsible. I don't know. But I mean, sometimes that's what it takes to really, for people, in the Old Testament we see that for them to really learn lessons, valuable lessons. Okay. Let's go on to verses 18 through 21. Brian, would you like to read that for us, please?
Then he said to Zebah and Zalmunna, where are the men whom you killed at Tabor? They answered, as you are, so were they. Every one of them resembled the son of a king. And he said, they were my brothers, the sons of my mother. As the Lord lives, if you had saved them alive, I will not kill you. So he said to Jether, his firstborn, rise and kill them. But the young man did not draw his sword, for he was afraid, because he was still a young man. Then Ziba and Zalmunna said, rise yourself and fall upon us, for as the man is, so is his strength. And Gideon arose and killed Ziba and Zalmunna, and he took the crescent ornaments that were on the necks of their camels.
All right. So now, it sort of turns from dealing with, the people of his own nation in terms of the men of Succoth and Penuel. And now he turns his attention to Ziba and Zalmunna. So they're still alive. Were they there when all this stuff was going on in these cities? Well, they were somewhere. Maybe they were put off to the side with some of the men watching them, and other men did what they did to the evil people in these cities. But now it's their turn, and so the language here is really hard to really understand what they're saying. So verse 18, we get a little bit more clarity as to the question getting asked to Ziba and Zalmunna in verse 19. Tabor, by the way, is a mountain of limestone in the northeastern part of the valley of Jezreel, and it's situated where the borders of Issachar, Zebulun, and Naphtali meet. That's according to Nelson's Illustrated Bible Dictionary. Verse 19 says, and he said, this is the men, or I should say, this is Gideon. He says, they were my brothers, the sons of my mother, and as the Lord lives, if only you had let them live, I would not kill you. So I looked at a number of different commentaries to really kind of figure out exactly what's being said here. And I think probably the one that I have here probably best explains it, and that's Leon D. Stancliffe in his God's Messages Bible commentary on Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. He says, quote, Gideon questioned the two kings as to the type of men they had killed while they were running rampant over the area of Mount Tabor near Gideon's home. It seems that Gideon suspected these two kings of having been responsible for the death of some of his own loved ones. Ziba and Zalmunna confessed that they had killed some men at the time they were at the place Gideon specified. They explained that the men that they had killed resembled Gideon, just as Gideon appeared to be a child of the king, so did the men they had killed. And so the idea is that these were family members of Gideon, and they were directly responsible for it. They had no authority to do that in terms of what they did. And so this seems to be a moment where they're being held accountable for really the direct wrongdoing towards his own family. So verse 20 says, Gideon says, so he said to Jether, his firstborn, rise, kill them. But the youth did not draw his sword, for he was afraid, because he was still a youth. And the youth, I noticed that when Brother Brian was reading, he says a young man. So the Brown Driver Briggs Hebrew English lexicon says boy, lad, youth, with special stress on youthfulness. But it's interesting, sometimes when you run into words like this to get an idea, is that the same word is used by King Saul before David was going to go fight Goliath in 1 Samuel 17:33. It was also the same word that the Bible writer used to describe David when Goliath saw him before their fight in 1 Samuel 17 and verse 42. So we're talking about a very young man. I kind of get the impression that maybe he's late teens or early 20s, but he's inexperienced of life. And so his father Gideon essentially is not going to kill these men. And we know they killed his own family members, so that's kind of surprising that he himself does not carry this task out. Was there a reason why that he gave it this job to his son? Well, the text doesn't really say. So anytime we go from what the text says, sometimes we can use other passages to sort of figure it out, and there's times where we just sort of have to speculate and kind of figure it out. So depending on the commentators you look at, and that's why when you study the Bible and you use commentaries, the rule of thumb is to use 3, because if you use 1, then you'll agree with everything he says pretty much, because you're never challenged to look at another point of view. So once you get more than one point of view, then you sit back and you go, which one seems like the best fit? And sometimes, you use as many as you possibly can that are good commentators. Commentators say, so this is sort of a survey of what I found, is that it's because of his inexperience that the son lacks, that he is uncomfortable with putting these men to death. I mean, he's just not ready for it. He's inexperienced, he's too young, he's intimidated by it. Others believe that by having the young son kill them as a novice soldier, it would have been done to disrespect these great men. In other words, if you get taken out by somebody, you don't want some lowly soldier doing it. You want to get taken out by some mighty soldier, because at least you didn't die at some tiny soldier or whatever, but somebody great took you out. Maybe the third one has the greatest amount of weight to it. If you think about what happened with Ephraim, remember they were having that big fuss at the beginning. How come, they weren't called to the battle? And, at the beginning in chapter 8, and Gideon says, listen, you guys took out 2 Midian chiefs. I mean, that is a major part of what we're doing here together. It says their anger subsided. So maybe what Gideon was trying to do was to give his son the honor of killing these great evil men, and really having the the honor fall to him. So whatever it may be, that one seems to me to be the best one of the bunch. But unfortunately, in the end, Gideon's son could not bring himself to do this. Verse 21, that's where we'll have to finish up tonight. It says, then Zebah and Zalmunna said, rise up yourself and fall on us, for as the man, so is his strength. So Gideon arose and killed Zebah and Zalmunna, and took the crescent ornaments which were on the camel's neck. So Gideon had no problem dealing with these guys, so we shouldn't think he gave it his son because he was afraid to take care of business. Gideon did what he had to do. What he did is he removed the crescent ornaments from the camel's necks, and what it says here in Brown Driver Briggs Hebrew English Lexicon is they're ornaments of some sort. International Bible Standard Bible Encyclopedia says they're moon-shaped necklaces, and so the idea that these were significant things, the idea of being wealth and status, that would reflect on your dress, and it would reflect on your camels. One of the things that was pretty typical today, which has happened in a lot of battles even through World War II, is that of looting. Once you prevail over those you're fighting, then there's all kinds of spoils of war. In World War II, guys were taking guns and patches and all kinds of stuff from the Nazis that they had conquered. That's pretty typical in ancient times. You just don't leave them all there. You say, man, that guy's got a better sword than me. I'm gonna take, what else you got there? So the idea is you would take that, or you would just take whatever, because essentially that can be bartered. Essentially that can be used to trade with others, whatever you want. So that would be
they would have took the crowns or something too, but
what's that?
you would have thought they would have taken their crowns.
Yeah, well, there's no mention of that, so it makes us wonder, since they're on the run, whether they actually had them, or did they leave them somewhere? Would they get left behind? They're hurried to, I don't know.
So you were saying when they caught people, like the enemies, they took their ammunition?
Well, when the battle was over, then you confiscate as many things that you have. I've spent some time studying World War II stuff, and what you have is Americans, if they they essentially took over place a German encampment, they would figure out how to get those tanks going. I mean, why not? You know, you would take whatever they have, and essentially
yeah.
you're not going to have to get, you know, supplies. Those are your supplies. You're going to use the enemy's stuff against them. So yeah, that was pretty typical of the spoils, and we'll kind of read when we pick up next week, Lord willing, you know, about a little bit more about the spoils, because Gideon has a request of all these men, and it has to do with the spoils that they have. Any questions, comments? Okay. Want to thank those who will be watching this video. Hopefully it'll be encouragement to you that you can be a serious follower of Christ. All you have to do is really have faith in God, and really put your best foot forward in living for God. But God bless you.